Welcome to the Mangalove channel. Today, we would like to introduce to you a story about a werewolf marked me as his mate. Now he shows up at my window every full moon like it's normal. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to Mangalove so you won't miss any of the newest stories. Now, let's dive right into today's story. Chapter 1. The New Creative Director. The loft was chaos, but the kind of chaos that smelled like creation. Sunlight spilled through high windows, splintering into ribbons that danced across paint-smeared floors and half-finished canvases. Someone's playlist hummed from a corner speaker, a blend of indie guitar and lo-fi beats, while the resident cat's sketch lounged like royalty on a blueprint that was definitely important. Rowan Hale wove through the mess like he'd been born in it. There were smudges of teal on his fingers, a streak of ochre at his wrist, and an easy calm in the way he navigated ladders, easels, and people who hadn't had enough caffeine yet. "Hey, careful with that cerulean," he called across the room, dimples flashing as he dodged a dripping brush. "That color costs more than your rent." The intern froze mid-splash. "Sorry, Rowan." Rowan grinned, pinning up a color sample board. "Don't apologize to me, apologize to the pigment gods." Laughter broke out, easy and familiar. This was the loft, a creative community space that felt more like home than anywhere he'd lived before. There were no cubicles, no white walls, just mismatched couches, ivy hanging from metal beams, and walls tattooed with art. The air was a collage of coffee, turpentine, and sunlight. Sketch yawned from atop the color chart, swatting lazily at a dangling tape measure. Rowan sighed. "We've talked about this, buddy." The cat blinked, unimpressed. "Fine," Rowan said solemnly, crouching. "You win, but if anyone asks why the palette's missing, I'm blaming you." "Negotiating with the cat again?" came a voice from behind. "Someone has to maintain order," Rowan quipped without turning, rolling his shoulders. "And he listens better than most humans." "Oh, hi, Mr. Alder." The loft's owner, Mr. Alder, was standing in the doorway, all cheerful chaos of scarves and coffee stains. "Morning, Rowan. Big day. The new creative director arrives in 5. Play nice." Rowan blinked. "We have a what now?" Alder beamed. "A new boss, some prodigy from Europe. You'll love him." Rowan felt his stomach sink. He liked the way things were. Comfortable, collaborative, no hierarchy breathing down their necks. "Great," he muttered. "Another suit who thinks paint should tell a story about synergy." Alder laughed, heading toward the entrance. "Just wait and see." The freight elevator groaned to life a few moments later. Conversations quieted. Brushes paused mid-stroke. Rowan glanced up, just as the doors slid open. Footsteps echoed across the concrete. A figure stepped out, tall, confident, carrying the sort of presence that drew eyes without asking for them. Olive skin, black hair with a single copper streak that caught the light like a live wire. And eyes, green, sharp, too familiar. The breath hitched in Rowan's throat. Lewis Hart. It had been 7 years, but there was no mistaking him. His jaw had sharpened, his shoulders broader, but his smile, slow, devastating, was exactly the same. "Hey, sunshine," Lewis said, his voice smooth as varnish on old wood. Rowan's world stuttered. The faint scent in the air, white tea and driftwood meeting dark fig and cardamom, felt like memory ambushing him. Every nerve remembered how that voice used to sound when whispered in the dark. "Lewis?" His own voice cracked like glass. He cleared it quickly, forcing composure. "So you're my new boss?" Lewis tilted his head, a smirk tugging one corner of his mouth. "Guess that makes you my favorite employee." The room laughed, someone clapped. Mr. Alder launched into introductions, but Rowan barely heard. The boy who used to trace stars on his wrist in foster care was now his superior, standing in a patch of light like he'd never left. And only Rowan knew that the new creative director had once been the center of his universe. Lewis's tour began like any first-day formality. Shake hands, nod, pretend they weren't both about to combust. "Over here's the mural division." Rowan said, tone all professionalism, as they wove between color wheels and stacks of canvas. Lewis followed close enough for his shadow to brush Rowan's arm. Still using warm bases for cool shades? Rowan glanced back, startled. You remember that? You used to mix colors backwards just to annoy the instructors. Lewis smiled faintly. He said rules were for people who didn't trust light. Rowan's cheeks burned. Well, I grew up. Rules have their uses. Do they? Lewis murmured, stepping around him to examine a painted panel. This gradient, driftwood white into ocean blue, that's you. Rowan folded his arms, trying not to stare at the copper streak in Lewis's hair. You always did have opinions about my palettes. And you always did tap your brushes when you're trying not to get emotional. Rowan froze. He hadn't realized he was doing it. Tap, tap. He shoved the brush into his pocket. I'm fine. Didn't say you weren't. The hum between them was unbearable. Every footstep felt choreographed by old ghosts. Lewis had the air of someone holding back entire conversations with his eyes alone. Rowan focused on breathing, on not letting every memory crawl out of its box. By the time they reached the communal lounge, he was sweating. Lunch came too quickly. The team gathered around picnic tables piled with takeout boxes and laughter. The room smelled like curry and acrylic. Lewis sat down beside Rowan without hesitation, thigh brushing his under the table. Rowan shifted an inch. Lots of seats, you know? Sure, Lewis said mildly, passing him a packet of sauce. Their fingers touched, brief, electric, but none with your company. Across the table, someone snickered, Boss man moves fast. Lewis grinned unbothered. Occupational hazard. I like sitting next to talent. Rowan nearly choked on his drink. Sketch, ever the chaos agent, leapt onto the table and stole a napkin. The group erupted in laughter as the cat darted away. Lewis rose to fetch it, crouching with surprising grace, coaxing the feline like he'd done it 1,000 times. He returned the crumpled napkin to Rowan, eyes soft. Still losing negotiations to cats. Rowan's smile faltered. For a split second, he saw another version of them. 2 boys in a foster home kitchen laughing as they fought over the last sandwich, promising they'd always stick together. That promise had broken like cheap glass. He pushed back from the table. Excuse me, need to check the inventory. The storage room was quiet, except for the faint hum of fairy lights strung between shelves. The scent of paint and cedar filled the space. Rowan exhaled, pressing his palms against the cool wall. Get it together, Hale. He's your boss now. That's it. The door creaked open. He didn't need to turn to know who it was. The air shifted, darker, familiar. Lewis stepped inside, closing the door behind him. You always did hide when you were overwhelmed. I'm not hiding. Rowan's voice was low, brittle. I'm working. Lewis took a step closer, careful as though approaching a wounded thing. You still bite your lip when you're mad. Don't? Rowan turned sharply, words catching when he saw how close they stood, only inches between them, breath mingling. His pulse thundered in his throat. You still think you can read me? Lewis's mouth curved, not a smirk this time, but something smaller, sadder. I spent years trying to forget how. The silence vibrated. Fairy lights flickered like a heartbeat. Lewis's gaze dropped briefly to Rowan's mouth, then lifted again, searching. The tension was almost physical, warm, charged. Rowan felt it too, the magnetic pull. His body remembered before his mind gave permission. His hand twitched, wanting to touch and shove all at once. Lewis leaned in a fraction. The air between them pulsed with scent and memory, and the echo of every night they'd whispered in bunk beds. Rowan's breath hitched. Don't. But Lewis didn't move closer. He just looked like the boy he'd once been, like he was seeing his home and not daring to reach for it. It was Rowan who broke first, stepping back until the cool shelving pressed into his spine. I have work to do. Lewis nodded, throat working. Right, you always did. Rowan pushed past him, heartbeat hammering so loud it drowned out the hum of the lights. "Great," he muttered under his breath, stalking toward the exit. "My ex is signing my paycheck." Later, after the lights dimmed and the loft emptied, Rowan locked up alone. The city's hum filtered through the cracked windows. He brushed his thumb over his bottom lip, irritated to find it trembling. On the mezzanine, Lewis stood in shadow, watching quietly. His expression was unreadable, except for the faint ache softening the edges of his eyes. Below them, the unfinished mural waited, strokes of color frozen mid-motion, like a heartbeat paused. Neither of them moved. Outside, the night deepened around the loft, holding its breath for what came next. Chapter 2. You Still Draw Me Like That. The loft hummed like a beehive. Daytime chatter thinned to a low hush, and the big windows traded their sunstruck bravado for a reflective, smoky sheen. Lamps pulled golden circles across the concrete, and dust motes floated like unhurried snow in the beams. Someone had left a jazz playlist on repeat. A muted trumpet drifted through the rafters as if the building itself were humming to stay awake. Rowan stayed because he said he would finish the gradient along the eastern wall, but also because staying felt like choosing himself. The world shrank down to bristle and pigment. He coaxed pale driftwood white into the lingering blue, testing the edges of light the way he always had. Light first, then color, then the smallest breath of shadow to make the rest confess its brightness. He should have gone home. He'd told himself that 3 times already. He should have ignored the way his chest still felt too tight after the afternoon, the way a single voice had unsettled every floorboard inside him. The freight elevator groaned. Sketch, the cat, slept on a stack of canvas dropcloths and did not wake. Rowan glanced toward the noise, brush midair. "Don't throw anything," Lewis said, stepping into the lamplight. He held up 2 paper cups by their lids, peace offering style. "I come bearing caffeine. Old habits die hard." Rowan set his brush down carefully. His heart, the traitor, leaped at the sight of Lewis's copper streak, catching warm light. "Your remembering my order is not an apology." "It's not." Lewis placed 1 cup on the rolling cart and kept the other. "It's a bribe for your time." "That's worse," Rowan said, but he couldn't keep the smile from tilting his mouth. "If you spike my productivity, Alder's going to expect miracles every night." Lewis's mouth flickered, just a hint of relief at being allowed to joke. "To be clear, I expect miracles only every other night." Rowan shook his head and peeled the lid off his coffee. Steam ghosted his face, twining with the scent that had haunted him all day. Dark fig and cardamom, warm, spiced, irresponsible, ribboning through his own clean white tea and driftwood. It felt a little like standing in an old kitchen, with a kettle singing and sunlight lying on the counter. A memory superimposed over the present until the two became difficult to tell apart. He dipped back into the paint, and after a minute realized Lewis had fallen into step beside him. There was no instructing, no commentary, just a second brush, a second rhythm. They didn't speak at first. The wall between their separate stretches of gradient disappeared by inches, then by inches again, until their strokes met and blended without either of them having to alter the pressure. Wordless synchronization, returning like the tide. The trumpet in the speakers slid into a line so lazy it felt airborne. Rowan exhaled. The nervous tightness in his shoulders loosened a notch, then another. "You still breathe when you paint," Lewis said eventually. A soft observation that didn't try to claim anything. "You used to tell me to do it. Breathe like you expect the color to show up for you." Rowan didn't look over. If he met those eyes too soon, he wasn't sure what he'd do. Everyone forgets to breathe when they're trying to be perfect. Lewis made a quiet sound that could have been agreement. "And you never tried for perfect?" Rowan snorted. "I tried for exactly right. It's worse." They kept going like that for a while, an easy exchange of murmured lines and brushstrokes, the kind of physical shorthand that only happens when 2 people have practiced under the same pressure for years. The room smelled like coffee and watercolor and the warm spice they couldn't talk about. Sketch woke, stretched luxuriously, and jumped down from his cloth fort to patrol beneath the ladder like a foreman. "Don't trip him," Rowan warned. I wouldn't dare, Lewis said. When they finally stepped back and let the wall breathe, Rowan reached for the cart. His hand brushed a battered pencil, and his fingers hesitated all on their own. The yellow paint was nicked off the barrel. Rowan had been gnawing at that spot all week while thinking through palette decisions. He watched his hand pick it up instead of the coffee. Still with the pencils, Lewis said lightly. Some addictions pay off, Rowan said, and meant it. His chest did that clogging thing again, the complicated one that wasn't relief but wasn't grief either. He'd forgotten how heavy biology could feel. The supply table was a sprawl of their mess, an abandoned tape measure, a tin full of charcoal sticks, the coffee lids they'd forgotten to throw away. Lewis set his cup down and leaned his hip against the table's edge. He ditched the blazer, shirt sleeves rolled, collar open at the throat. He looked less like a prodigy and more like a person who had stayed alive by deciding to. I kept them, Lewis said suddenly, his voice low and a shade unsteady. He didn't look at Rowan when he said it. He looked at the pencils, as if they might rearrange into something safer. That was ages ago. Years, Lewis agreed, lifting his gaze. Not an age. I kept them flat when I could, smoothed the creases when I couldn't, taped the edges. The corner of his mouth bent, self-mocking. You drew me like I was worth framing. It was arrogant to believe you. It was also the only thing that kept me from shaking apart. Rowan's laughter came out too fast and too soft. I drew you because you'd go still when I did. Lewis held his eyes for several breaths. The room was so quiet, the cat's collar bell sounded loud as a clock. You were the only place I knew how to be still, he said, almost a whisper. That shouldn't have knocked the air out of Rowan, but it did. His body kept him upright while the rest of him reeled. Muscle memory could not be underestimated. He set the pencil down because if he fidgeted with it, he might draw something no one was ready to see. Maybe don't say things like that when I'm trying very hard to be emotionally responsible, he said softly. Lewis's expression broke at the edges, not in a pretty way. I'm trying very hard to be responsible too. He tilted his head toward the wall. We did good work. Rowan swallowed, nodded. We did. He climbed the ladder to check a line along the top seam, grateful for tasks that came with instructions. From up there, the world simplified. Color, line, light. He pulled a small brush through the faint border between his and Lewis's sections, fusing them by degrees until there was no sign of the handoff. Hold still, he said, mostly to himself. Then he hissed when cold air kissed his cheek. What? Lewis was at the foot of the ladder. You okay? Rowan touched his face and glanced at his fingers. A smear of pale gray blue stared back. I made friends with the wall. Lewis moved forward. Don't move. He rose onto the second rung and reached up with his thumb. The pad of it was warm as it pressed gently to Rowan's cheekbone, rubbing slow arcs that smelled like cardamom and the smallest hint of citrus from the soap Lewis preferred when he was 19 and thought no one noticed. Rowan's breath misbehaved. He held still because he was told to, not because he couldn't have moved if he'd wanted to. The thumb lingered a heartbeat too long. Rowan didn't move. The air between their mouths teased and tightened. Sketch launched himself onto the dropcloth pile with a thud. They both jumped. Rowan choked on a wild laugh he couldn't control. Lewis laughed a second later, the sound ragged with relief. Of course, Rowan managed. He has timing. He always did, Lewis said. Rowan climbed down, brushing his palms on his jeans. He put the brush away because it gave his hands something to do. The clock over the mezzanine said it was late. The windows said rain was sniffing at the edges of the night. I should close up, he said. Lewis nodded. I can help with the shutters. They worked in companionable quiet again, the kind that had edges of safety and edges of everything that threatened safety. Rowan walked the length of the room, turning off lamps until the space fell into warm, narrower pockets of light. When he reached the door and turned the deadbolt, rain finally arrived in a soft sweep, tapping the glass like a polite stranger. He turned to go and nearly collided with Lewis. Sorry, Rowan said, stepping sideways. Lewis didn't block him. He reached out instead and caught Rowan's wrist with a hand that closed like a question, not an order. His touch wasn't tight. It was impossibly gentle, thumb landing almost exactly where an old foster home bracelet had once left an imprint. "I never stopped wanting you," Lewis said. The words were simple, unornamented. They did not ask for forgiveness, they did not bargain, they just existed between them, dampening the air and making every drop of rain outside feel louder. Rowan's pulse tried to climb up into Lewis's palm, traitorous and bright. He watched it hammer against skin that remembered the same heartbeat years ago. Something inside him ran, then stopped, then turned around to face what it had been avoiding for days or months or 7 whole years. "You don't get to say that like it's," he swallowed, "like it's easy." "Nothing about it is easy," Lewis said. His thumb moved once, an unconscious circle that calmed and set fire simultaneously. "But it is true." Rowan pulled his wrist back slowly, feeling the drag of skin leaving skin more vividly than he wanted to. He didn't look up as he passed Lewis by and headed toward the long shadow thrown by the mural's corner. He pretended he needed to check a seam he'd already checked twice. Lewis didn't follow. Rowan stopped anyway, because pretending has a half-life, and his had run out. He stood in the shallow darkness where the wall jutted, staring at the soft wave they'd painted together. The room was almost entirely quiet now. The jazz had clicked off. The rain had grown steadier. "Rowan," Lewis said behind him, a careful call. He turned, and turning felt like surrender and strategy at once. His body arrived at the decision, a breath before his mind. The space between them shut with a soundless click. He didn't remember who reached first, only the way relief and panic collided, a wild, bright noise that hummed through bone. Lewis kissed him like memory and apology and hello, all layered at once. It wasn't desperate at first. It was careful, then reverent, a request. Rowan's mouth answered, a yes that didn't promise anything beyond this moment, but didn't deny what came before it either. The kiss deepened with the easing of old locks. Rowan stepped forward and felt Lewis's hand slid to the back of his neck, warm as he remembered. Shirts stayed between them. It didn't matter. Their chests found a rhythm that felt like language. Rowan's back met the cool brick with a quiet tap. Lewis braced a palm beside his head, carving out space so Rowan could leave if he wanted. Rowan did not want to. He hooked his fingers in the fabric at Lewis's waist and pulled, feeling the give, the heat, the thrill of knowing he still knew the shape of this person under layers of years. They kissed for a while, the way people do when time has refused them for too long. Urgent for a second, then slow enough to relearn. A soft sound escaped Rowan. It was swallowed by Lewis's mouth and returned as a gentler sound, an echo. When Rowan finally broke away, he did it on a breath that came out messy. This changes things. Lewis's forehead pressed to his, a soft lean that asked no more than the contact gave. Only if you want it to. Rain thickened, sluicing louder across the windows. A curtain pulled across the outside world. They stood there in their small pool of almost dark, breathing each other's air like they were exchanging weather reports. "We still work together," Rowan said, because facts were the only handholds he trusted right now. "I can be your boss and not own you," Lewis said. "I will be your boss and not own you." Then, lower, "I've never wanted you that way." Rowan closed his eyes. The truth landed in his chest like a weight and a rope ladder. He nodded once and stepped aside, giving the brick back its job. "I'm locking up," he said. Lewis's hand fell to his side. He didn't push. He didn't reach again. He stepped back into the light where he was easier to parse. "I'll get the mezzanine." They parted with a look that felt like a promise to try, and at the same time, a mutual permission to retreat without losing what had been gained. It wasn't clean. It was human. The rain met them at the door. The night had turned the street into a long ribbon of reflection. Puddles held gold circles where the lamps fell. The city moved around them in soft, wet hushes. Rowan locked the last bolt and stared through the glass for a second before he pushed into the cool outside air. He tilted his head to read a poster stapled to the utility pole. The paper wavered under the drizzle, a bright rectangle with handwritten stars at the margin. Youth Arts Fundraiser, Saturday. Paint, pizza, people. A tiny sketch at the bottom showed two stick figures building a paper house under a sun with too many rays. Rowan's throat tightened without permission. He thought of an old kitchen again, the raw-edged hope of two kids with nothing but pencils and a list of impossible promises. He remembered a summer day. They tried to draw their future with crayons. Windows first, so they'd have a way to look out if the walls closed in. He walked to his bike and leaned one forearm on the seat, rain stippling the fabric at his shoulders. He opened his phone, then closed it, then opened it again. His hand moved before the cautious part of him could decide. He took a picture, the little pencil drawing he kept tucked under a paint jar in his backpack. A boy sleeping with his hand under his cheek, hair falling over his eyes. The shape of a second boy's hand reaching from the edge of the page, almost touching, titled in the corner, "Tomorrow Morning." He sent the photo to the contact he'd never deleted, decades ago, renamed simply L, and then buried under life. For several seconds, the rain filled the space where all their words should have been. A car rolled by, tires hissing. Somewhere, a siren complained far away, and then gave up. His phone buzzed. One message. I remember every line. Rowan closed his eyes. The reply wasn't an apology. It wasn't a plea. It was recognition, clean and unadorned, as if two maps had been laid one over the other, and the streets aligned in a few crucial places. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. Across the street, a puddle held the upside-down glow of the loft sign and the outline of his own shoulders, narrow as ever, under his jacket. He didn't feel smaller, though. He felt like a person walking with his eyes open in the rain. As he swung onto his bike and pushed off, the city looked a shade brighter in the wet. Behind him, high on the mezzanine, a figure stood at the window with one palm pressed to the glass, watching a silhouette ride into the night until the rain blurred out and the world became only light and sound again. Chapter 3. What We Pretend Not to Feel. The loft hummed like a beehive. Midday sunlight filtered through the skylights, catching on glass art installations and drying racks. People moved fast, voices overlapping. Someone yelled for gaffer tape. Someone else swore about misplaced fabric samples. Cameras clicked as a small production crew set up for a promotional shoot. Rowan Hale wove through the crowd with a clipboard, dodging an easel and two interns arguing over lighting angles. His hair was a little messier than usual, ink-streaked fingers tapping in time with the music humming through the space. Sketch, their cat mascot, strutted down the aisle like he owned the place. Okay, everyone. Lewis's voice cut through the noise, calm, low, commanding enough to still the chaos. He stood at the center of the room in his rolled-up sleeves and subtle authority, somehow making a casual stance look cinematic. We've got clients in 15. Let's make them believe we're geniuses. Rowan muttered under his breath. That part's not the problem. It's making them believe you're not terrifying. Lewis's mouth twitched as if he'd heard. Rowan, you'll co-lead the walkthrough. You're the best with color stories. Rowan stopped mid-step. Co-lead with you? You're my favorite employee, remember? Lewis smiled, all false innocence. Several coworkers snickered. One whispered, they're basically married. Rowan ignored them and forced a polite tone. Fine, but if you start mansplaining gradients, I'll stage a walkout. 15 minutes later, he stood at the front of the loft's largest open hall, flanked by displays of hand-painted mock-ups and concept boards. The clients, a trio of trend analysts and a marketing exec, looked intrigued but skeptical. Lewis gestured to him. Rowan will explain how we integrate emotional temperature into color flow. Right, Rowan exhaled and switched on the presentation screen. So, color temperature, it's not just warm versus cool. It's about emotional accessibility. For example, as he clicked to the next slide, Sketch the cat leapt onto the projector table. His furry silhouette appeared on the presentation, tail flicking directly over a carefully rendered gradient. The room burst into laughter. Rowan sighed. And that's our secret model, sketch, demonstrating our brand's commitment to chaos. Louis pressed his lips together, fighting a smile. Organic movement, right? Exactly, Rowan said dryly. The cat's a metaphor for spontaneity. But once he started, the nerves vanished. His passion for color took over. His words warm, his hands sketching invisible arcs through the air as he talked about how blue balances emotional density, how gold invites engagement, how light changes the conversation between pigments. By the end, the clients were nodding, murmuring to each other. When the group applauded lightly, Louis's glance flicked toward him. A spark of pride, unspoken but unmistakable. Rowan pretended not to see it. The material library smelled like dust, paper, and acrylic resin. Shelves of swatches and fabric books lined the narrow space. After the tour, Rowan ducked inside, looking for quiet, and found Louis already there, flipping through a set of sample binders. Seriously, Rowan said, don't you have people to charm? None as charming as you, Louis said without looking up. Rowan's pulse stuttered before he could stop it. Stop looking at me like that. Louis glanced up, brows raised. How? Like I used to. That landed too perfectly, too sharp. Rowan's fingers slipped. The entire fan deck of paint swatches scattered across the floor in a flurry of colors. Louis crouched to help, reaching the same moment Rowan did. Their hands brushed heat under the cool hum of air conditioning. Seriously, Rowan muttered, pretending to focus on sorting by hue. You're making people talk. Louis gathered a handful of swatches, eyes steady. Let them. They'd only be half right. Rowan didn't answer, because the truth was, everyone assuming they were together wasn't the problem. It was how right it sometimes felt, how his pulse reacted like it remembered. A voice from the doorway called, "Hey, lovebirds, we're setting up for the shoot." Rowan dropped the last swatch and buried his face in his hands. I hate this place. Louis's low laugh was unfairly warm. You love this place. I hate that you're in it, Rowan shot back too fast. Louis stepped closer quietly. Then why do you keep meeting my eyes? Rowan looked up and realized they were standing too close again. Now the air charged with that same electricity that had haunted every moment since he'd returned. He stepped back quickly, knocking into the shelf. Because you're impossible to ignore. Louis smiled faintly. I'll take it. By mid-afternoon, thunder cracked above the city. The storm came fast, drumming against the skylights until the whole building sounded like a heartbeat trapped in glass. The photo shoot paused. Crew members scrambled to cover equipment. Rowan was adjusting a prop, a curved glass installation meant to refract color for a backdrop, when it slipped and cracked at the edge. A thin shard caught his finger. He hissed and shook his hand. Rowan! Louis was there before he could grab a paper towel. He guided him gently toward the counter. His movements sure, controlled. Hold still. It's fine. It's just Louis's voice softened as he grabbed the first aid kit. His hand was steady, his expression unreadable. He cleaned the small cut with antiseptic, his fingers brushing light over Rowan's skin. You never did take care of yourself properly. Rowan wanted to roll his eyes, but the breath caught in his chest when Louis blew lightly across the cut to dry it. The warmth of his breath against Rowan's knuckles made everything inside him tilt sideways. Louis taped the small bandage neatly. Then, without thinking, his thumb traced a small circle around Rowan's wrist, lingering where pulse met skin. A silent apology, a wordless, I should have been there. Rowan looked at him. The rain filled the silence. Thanks, he said finally, voice lower than intended. Louis's mouth quirked, faint and careful. Don't mention it. They didn't. By the time the storm eased, the sky had turned deep violet. The crew cleared out, leaving puddles near the loading dock. Louis offered him a ride, and Rowan, too tired to fight, agreed. The car smelled faintly of bergamot and leather. Rain streaked the windshield. The wipers kept an awkward rhythm. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The city lights smeared into watercolor shapes beyond the window. Rowan leaned his head back. I don't know how to do this without hating you a little. Louis's hands tightened on the steering wheel, but his tone stayed gentle. You don't have to skip steps. Rowan's laugh was small, hollow. You make it sound so simple. It's not. Lewis glanced at him briefly. But you're allowed to feel both. The quiet stretched again, thicker now, but not suffocating. It felt almost honest. When the car finally stopped in front of Rowan's apartment building, Lewis didn't move. His hands rested loosely on the wheel, eyes forward. He didn't unbuckle, didn't lean in, just waited. Rowan hesitated. The rain had softened to mist, painting the street in reflections. His voice came out barely audible. You want to come up for a drink? Lewis looked at him then, searching for hesitation. Finding none, he nodded once. Yeah, for a drink. Rowan's apartment was small, lived in, and full of proof that he'd never really stopped drawing. Sketchbooks lay open on every surface. Tiny plants climbed toward the light, and on one shelf, half hidden behind a fern, a framed sketch of Lewis, drawn years ago, peeked from the corner. Lewis saw it and smiled softly. You kept that? Rowan busied himself with the kettle. I keep a lot of things. They made tea in mismatched mugs. The space filled with the hiss of the kettle, the faint purr of rain beyond the balcony, and the kind of silence that didn't ache anymore. It hummed instead, quietly alive. They talked about work, about paint shortages, about how Sketch probably ran the entire operation. Laughter came easy again, the edges of their conversation rounding out until Rowan found himself smiling without meaning to. Lewis leaned back on the couch, one arm draped across the top. You always made places feel like home. That's just clutter, Rowan said, grinning. No, Lewis said softly. It's warmth. Rowan rolled his eyes to hide how that landed. Flattery works better when it's less poetic. Can't help it, Lewis said, shifting closer. You bring out the metaphors. The air thickened between them, tension rippling just beneath the laughter. When Lewis's hand brushed his knee, Rowan didn't pull away. Their gazes locked. The smile faded, replaced by something unspoken but known. The first kiss happened because neither could stand pretending any longer. It was slow at first, hesitant, then deeper, sweeter, urgent, in that quiet, aching way of rediscovery. Rowan felt himself melt into it, into the familiarity, the spark, the gentleness that had always been Lewis's undoing. Hands found hair, shirt buttons, old geography learned anew. His breath came fast, heart tripping against ribs. But just as the edge of the moment tipped toward heat, Lewis stopped. He rested his forehead against Rowan's, breathing hard. Not yet, he whispered. Not until you trust me again. Rowan blinked, dazed. You ridiculous green flag tyrant. Lewis laughed softly, pressing a kiss to his temple instead. You'll thank me later. Doubt it, Rowan muttered, cheeks flushed, but his voice was smiling. They cleaned up their cups together, bumping shoulders like nothing monumental had just happened. You are listening to a narrated story on the Mangalove channel. Don't forget to share your thoughts about today's story. The air felt lighter now, less haunted, more alive. Lewis paused at the door. Tomorrow's shoot starts late. Sleep in. Rowan nodded, lips curved. You too, boss. Later, the rain faded to a whisper. Rowan sat by his window, sketchbook open on his lap. He drew without thinking. A rooftop garden, string lights glinting across an imagined night sky. The kind of place where maybe they'd stop running from themselves. Across town, in his parked car, Lewis stared through the windshield at the same rain. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through old files until he found the photo he'd never deleted. A beach they'd once drawn together when they were teenagers, promising to come back someday and finish the sketch. He sent it, a simple text. Tomorrow. Rowan looked at his screen, smiled faintly, and typed back. Tomorrow. Outside, the storm finally quieted. The city exhaled. Somewhere between 2 apartments and 7 years of history, something fragile began to rebuild itself. Not with grand gestures, but with the soft, steady rhythm of 2 people deciding to try again. Chapter 4. The Things We Ran From. Morning came gray and soft like paper soaked once and left to dry. Rowan woke to the small, companionable sound of rain testing the balcony rail. His apartment held the quiet of a museum before opening, the kettle's gentle rattle, the whisper of a plant leaf brushing the window when the air moved. He padded barefoot to the kitchen and set water to boil, then paused when he found Louis already there, standing very still with his hands around a mug he hadn't poured yet. They hadn't planned this. Louis had stayed too late, then not left at all. He'd taken the couch without argument, long and neat under Rowan's oldest throw. Now, in the grayness, he looked less like a creative director, and more like every version of him Rowan had kept sketching by accident. Barefoot, sleeves pushed to the elbow, the copper streaks soft in the damp light. "Morning," Rowan said. Louis's mouth moved like he was relearning the word. Morning. The kettle clicked off. Tea steam braided into the quiet. They stood a breath too far apart, as if proximity might decide the answers for them. Rowan poured 2 mugs, slid one across the counter, and nodded toward the couch. They sat at either end, knees angled like parentheses around the same sentence. Sketch jumped up between them, tail curling against Louis's wrist, then arranged himself with the entitlement of royalty and began to purr. They let the sound fill the space until Rowan realized there were no more ways to postpone what waited. "I need it," he said finally. "All of it. Not the version you'd give a meeting, the truth." Louis nodded, his fingers tightened once around the mug, then loosened. When he looked up, his face had that careful, gentle bravery Rowan recognized from nights in a bunk bed when telling the truth cost them sleep. "I was 18, Louis said. "You know that part? You know about the portfolio review, the one Alder's friend arranged. There was a man there, a kind of a hurricane in a suit. He said he'd seen 1,000 kids like me and a handful like me, and he could tell the difference. Your mentor," Rowan said, trying to keep the word from sounding like a rival. Louis breathed. "He became my legal guardian to get me overseas. He said it was the only way. The paperwork, the visas, the academy, it happened fast. Too fast. He had rules about contact. No friends, no one from before. He said the first years decided everything. He said I couldn't afford distractions. He said love at 18 was a beautiful lie." Rowan stared into his tea as if it might give him someone else's reaction. "You didn't fight him?" "I did, you know me." A small smile caught and broke. "But lawyers and signatures outrun 18-year-olds. He put it into papers. No contacting former guardians, foster homes, or any individuals I'd had placement with. He said it was to keep people, his word, holding me back. It felt like handcuffs made of opportunity, and I let them close because I couldn't see a way to get where I wanted without wearing them." The rain leaned a little harder on the glass. Rowan set his cup down because his hands had started to shake. "I thought you chose ambition." Louis's answer came without a pause. "I chose survival. I chose the door that wasn't locked, even if it meant leaving through it alone. But I came back for us the day I could. I got off the plane on my 21st birthday and went straight to the address I had for you." Rowan lifted his eyes. "I'd moved." "You'd moved." Louis's voice was steady, but something in it frayed at the edge. "I went to the foster home. New staff, files gone. I wrote to every address I could find for you. Letters came back stamped with little boxes, undeliverable, returned to sender. I kept them anyway, like an idiot, because it felt less like failure to have them." Rowan scrubbed a hand over his face. He remembered those years in different colors, muted, gray, interrupted by small, sudden brightnesses. "I was couch hopping by then. A scholarship came through. I took it. I wanted a number that meant I could stay in one place. I thought you chose a different number." "I chose breathing." Louis's eyes met his, bare. "And I thought maybe you'd learn to breathe without me. That doesn't excuse it, but it's what I thought." Rowan held his gaze until the kettle's cooling ping found a place to land. "It doesn't excuse it," he repeated softly, feeling how much he wanted it to. "But it explains it." A long breath spilled out of both of them at once, like a room deflating. They looked at each other and absurdly laughed, the kind of short, watery laugh that confesses how tragic you know you sound. "Listen to us," Rowan said, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand and smearing a tiny streak of watercolor he hadn't realized was still there. Two men with a cat and a tea set performing an operatic tragedy. Lewis reached slow enough to be stopped. He took Rowan's hand, turned it palm up, and brushed a kiss over the paint smudge at his knuckle. It wasn't dramatic. It was deliberate asking. Rowan let him. His throat burned in the best and worst ways. "You're not forgiven because you kissed my hand."
I know, Lewis's smile didn't pretend to be anything other than nervous, but I wanted to start where it hurt. "Start here then," Rowan said and tugged him up. They moved through the apartment without talking. Rowan pulled open drawers with the same small ceremony people use when they're introducing a person to their family. From under a stack of receipts, he pulled a scrap of paper. Lewis, asleep in profile, mouth soft, captioned in tiny letters, "Exhale." From between two cookbooks, Lewis at a window, shoulder blades like wings under a shirt, titled "Weather" from a shoebox. A laugh caught with two lines and a shadow, the copper streaks ingested with three strokes called proof. He didn't look at Lewis while he laid them out. He laid out more on the bookshelf, in the plant pot saucer, slid from behind a frame where a carefully torn edge admitted that once he'd ripped a drawing out of himself because holding it in had felt like choking. Sketch followed them with great interest, as if this were a game he'd been practicing for. "I tried to stop," Rowan said, voice small and fierce at once. "I did. I would put the pencils in a drawer and swear I was done, but my hand kept remembering. It kept," he gestured, helpless. "It kept drawing you." When he looked up, Lewis looked undone. Not pretty, not dignified, undone. His eyes shone without spilling. His jaw worked like he was swallowing stones. "I kept you in shirts," Lewis said hoarsely, one corner of his mouth lifting at the thinnest edge of it. "Yours that you left, yours that I bought because they smelled like white tea, even if they didn't. I kept you by reading the things you loved and hating them on principle. I kept you by refusing to sketch anyone else's sleeping face. I know that sounds ridiculous." "It sounds like ours," Rowan said. They stood in the middle of the small storm they'd made with paper and graphite, and for a minute, the only sound was the rain and the thin purr from the couch. The apartment felt full of two boys and two grown men layered together until the outlines blurred. If Rowan had been painting it, he would have washed the whole scene with the palest driftwood, then let Fig Dark pull at the edges and wick inward. On the couch again, they sat closer. The quiet thickened with something that wasn't restraint this time. It was choice. Rowan leaned in first. The kiss was not careful. It was certain. He tasted tea and rain in a life they hadn't gotten to finish before. Lewis caught him with a sound that felt like unwinding. One hand at the curve of Rowan's neck, the other at his waist, anchoring without claiming. The world narrowed to temperature and breath. Shirts loosened, then loosened more. Skin met fingertip, maps redrawn with touches that knew how to ask and how to listen. They moved like people who had learned where to leave space. Mouths traced familiar paths with new care. Rowan on the place behind Lewis's ear that always made his breath stutter. Lewis relearned the way Rowan's spine arched when fingers skimmed the lowest rib. Their breath synced without them trying. When Rowan drew back, flushed and open, Lewis followed. Then stopped with his lips at Rowan's jaw, breathing there like he was memorizing a coastline. "Not yet," Lewis murmured, the words against skin. "When it's about forever, not apology." Rowan's eyes burned. He nodded, a tiny movement that felt cathedral-sized, and smiled with his mouth and his hands at once. "Okay." They folded into each other under the throw like a decision, like a yes held for later. Sketch circled twice and tucked himself at their feet, like a living seal on a document. Rain topped the glass with small, polite knuckles. The gray morning peeled back toward afternoon without asking for anything from them. Rowan woke first in the dim, a lamp left on low, casting amber over the copper in Lewis's hair. He lay there and stared, because he could,
because no one was hurrying him, because the word that rose in his chest, unassuming and stricken and whole, was home. He reached out and smoothed a thumb over a line at the corner of Louis's mouth he hadn't drawn yet. Louis's lashes fluttered, then stilled. Rowan's phone buzzed on the coffee table. He flinched, then fished it up one-handed so he wouldn't jostle Louis. A message from Alder. Unveiling set for next Friday. Community invite list attached. PR wants both of you on stage. Our mural deserves the town. He swallowed around a smile and angled the screen so the light didn't wake Louis. When he looked down, Louis's eyes were open, soft and unguarded, already reading him like he always had. Big night? Louis asked, his voice sleep-rough. Unveiling, Rowan said. They want us both to speak. Louis's hand moved, found Rowan's where it lay across his chest, threaded their fingers without making a point of it. Stand with me. A step behind, Rowan said automatically, the old choreography slipping out. Like always, Louis turned his head enough to press a kiss to the side of Rowan's wrist. No, beside me. The words clicked somewhere under Rowan's ribs, an old latch releasing, and he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. So he did both quietly into Louis's shoulder, until Louis kissed his hair, and the rain and the lamp and the cat conspired to make him feel not ridiculous at all. The week that followed moved like a film with choices in it. At work, Louis did something Rowan had never seen him do when a room watched him. He stepped back. In meetings, he said, Rowan led this palette study, and then shut up. When the PR team tried to center the new creative director in the narrative, Louis said, our color language is his. I'm not contradicting the truth for a headline. When vendors asked for decisions, he said, Rowan has final say on anything that touches light temperature, like it was gravity and not preference. And it wasn't performative. He didn't make a spectacle of giving credit or asking consent. He treated it like part of craft. At lunch, when their knees knocked under the bench, he didn't leave them there out of stubbornness. He moved his leg an inch and pressed his foot to Rowan's, small and sure, like a check-in. When he reached for Rowan's hand in a library, he did it with his eyes first, the question clear enough to be answered without words. When Rowan shook his head, because a corridor wasn't where he wanted to be brave, Louis's hand fell away immediately, and his smile didn't dim. A dozen times a day, Rowan felt something tight inside him ease. He laughed more, and it didn't sound like defense. He argued with Louis about deadlines and photography schedules and the narrative arc of the unveiling, and their bickering showed its bones. They liked building things together. Their colleagues started whispering fondly, and frankly, they're good for each other. They work better as a set. On Tuesday, Rowan caught Louis introducing himself to the youth volunteers like he wasn't famous in their tiny world. I'm Louis, he said to a kid, clutching a paintbrush like a lifeline. He's the person you should bother with color questions. I'm here for ladders and snacks. On Wednesday, Rowan saw the PR email that had tried to change the mural's theme from belonging to innovation, and watched the polite, lethal message Louis sent back. We are not selling a clever trick. We are telling a neighborhood it already lives here. He signed it with both of their names, then checked with Rowan if that was okay. On Thursday, they had dinner on the steps outside the loft with takeout cartons and a blanket. They didn't define anything. They didn't pretend anything wasn't hard. They kissed like they were riding with their mouths and chose stopping places together. By Friday, the rooftop crew was testing string lights for the after-party. The sky bruised toward blue-black. The bulbs pinged alive in lines that looked like sheet music. The city's breath lifted at the edges, cooling the sweat on the back of Rowan's neck. He stood with his hands on the parapet and watched an evening he recognized from 100 sketches arrive. Footsteps came quiet behind him. Louis took his place at the railing without touching him, their arms a warm echo apart. From here, the mural waited below them under its cover, the secret they'd given the wall and each other. Are you ready? Louis asked. No, Rowan said truthfully, but I want to be. Louis nodded like that was the right answer. The string lights hummed down in the street. Someone laughed like a bell. On the air, a faint drift of basil from an upstairs window found the ghost of fig and tea and made a new thing between them that Rowan didn't have a name for yet. He turned to look at Louis. They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. They shared a look that did the kissing for them. Private, wry, a little feral with hope. All the things they'd run from were still there, but smaller now, or maybe just right-sized. The city stretched open around them, an empty page that didn't scare them like it used to. "Tomorrow," Rowan said, and it wasn't a stall, it was a promise. "Tomorrow," Lewis echoed. Light spilled from the rooftop in gentle lines, painting both of them in a temporary halo. Somewhere beneath their feet, in colors still hidden, their mural kept its own quiet, waiting heart. Chapter 5. You Still Belong Here. By sunset, the loft's courtyard looked like a street fair had fallen in love with a garden party. String lights crisscrossed the sky, brightening one by one as the blue deepened. 2 food trucks idled at the curb, breathing out warm smells of basil fries and cinnamon churros. Kids chalked spirals on the concrete. Older neighbors unfolded camp chairs and nodded approval at everything. A local trio tuned up by the loading dock, the guitar's first notes jumping like birds startled into evening. Rowan stood near the entry gates with a stack of programs and hands that wouldn't stop shaking. His palms dampened the paper. The silk drape over the mural moved in the small wind like a curtain that could hear applause ahead of time. "You're doing fine," said a voice that always found the right distance. Lewis slid in beside him, not crowding him, not missing him either. He wore a dark shirt, open at the throat, sleeves rolled. The copper streak in his hair flashed under a string light and then hid. "Or rather," he amended, "you'll do fine even if you don't think so. That's the trick with magic." "Helpful," Rowan said, a little strangled. "Tell the tremor that." Lewis reached up and, public, visible, unafraid, curved his hand gently on Rowan's shoulder. Not possessive, never that. A steadying weight, a line thrown across a small wave. "Hey," he said quietly, "we built a thing that belongs to everyone. You don't have to hold it alone." Rowan blew out a breath. The skin under Lewis's fingers warmed. The rest of him followed. "Okay." The gates opened wider. A cluster of teenagers spilled in, laughing, pointing at the lights as if they'd invented dusk. A group of former foster staff arrived together. 4 women and a man Rowan remembered in half snapshots. Someone who taught him to bake. Someone who hid extra pencils in the snack cupboard. Someone who used to set down 2 mugs of tea after another long day and say, "All storms end, you know?" One of them caught sight of him and pressed her hand to her heart. His breath hitched. "Go," Lewis murmured. "Let them see you." Rowan took a step, then another, and then he was surrounded by the past and comforted by how it didn't claw anymore. The older woman with the tea voice hugged him hard. "Look at you," she said, tearful and triumphant. "You made color your home," he laughed, and the laugh shook something loose. "Took a lot of paint. Worth every drop," she said, then side-eyed Lewis over his shoulder. "You keep being decent, young man." Lewis accepted the admonition like a blessing. "Yes, ma'am." Sketch made his entrance just then, revealed from behind a monitor stand like royalty emerging from stiff curtains. Someone had actually tied a miniature bow tie around his neck. The courtyard erupted with delight. "Oh no," Rowan said under his breath. "He's unstoppable." Sketch spent 5 minutes working the crowd, rubbing on ankles, obligingly posing on a speaker, curling up on the edge of the check-in table as if to sign off on every name with an imperious blink. A child squealed when the cat batted a churro end with practiced elegance. "See?" Lewis said, unofficial host. "The only reason I'm not nervous is because everyone's watching him," Rowan said. His hands, traitors that they were, had stopped shaking. The band settled into a low, happy rhythm. In the far corner, someone set a tray of lemonade next to a jar labeled "Donations for Youth Arts," and Rowan felt something bright and sharp in his chest. Gratitude with a keen edge. Alder wandered by, beaming in a striped jacket, and clapped both of them on the back. 5 minutes, he announced, the way a ringmaster warns the trapeze. The silk breathed. The wind shifted. The light felt like the part in a song when your favorite line arrives. Rowan glanced at Lewis. "Don't you dare make your speech better than mine." "I can't," Lewis said, Lewis's smile quick as a wink. "I'm planning to steal yours and call it collaboration." Rowan snorted and wiped his palms on his pants, then realized there were paint smudges there from a late afternoon touch-up. Somehow that steadied him more than anything else. Paint traveled with him into rooms like luck. They moved to the small stage. The mic hummed in that way microphones do right before they behave.
Alder introduced them with the breathless enthusiasm of an uncle at a graduation. The small crowd pressed closer. A gentle wave of faces, artists and neighbors, city folk and kids, the staff who had made homes for other people, lanyards, plastic cups, pride. Louis stepped to the mic first because that's what they decided. He could hold the beginning without letting it run away. "Good evening," he said. The voice he used for rooms had iron in it and a thread of velvet. Here, he braided the thread thicker. "You've all been part of the loft, whether you've known it or not. You've sent us ideas and teenagers and old chairs that turned into sculptures. You've sent us your Saturdays, your laughter, your patience when we blocked loading zones with ladders. Tonight, we get to give something back that you already owned. Soft laughter, the kind that leans in. And to the artist who made color mean something again, Rowan Hale." The name moved through the courtyard like a fuse. Applause caught, then spread. Louis's eyes never left Rowan. He didn't move out of the way. He just shifted the space so Rowan could enter it. "He taught us that belonging looks like light finding the corners," he said, warmth threaded through every word, "and that the corners are the best part." Rowan, pink-cheeked, dimples unfairly large, stepped up and tried very hard not to stare at the person who had just offered him the sky. "Hi," he said into the mic, which amplified his awkwardness into something charming. "I'm Rowan. I know a lot of you. If I don't, I'd like to." Laughter again. He glanced at the drape, back at the crowd. "We painted this for all the times rooms felt like walls. We painted it for the kids who were told their colors were too much or not enough. We painted it for the staff who stayed until midnight to make sure dinner happened, and for the neighbors who came by with ladders and extension cords and opinions." He found the staff cluster, lifted his cup. "Especially opinions." "Always," the tea-voiced woman called, dabbing her eye. Rowan's heart, which had been trying to sprint all evening, slowed to a steady trot. "We hope when you pass by this wall, you'll feel taller," he swallowed, and then the last line arrived exactly the way he'd rehearsed it, and not at all. "We hope it lets light find you. That's what it did for us." Applause like a soft rain. Louis's expression a steadying plane. Alder wiping his face with his sleeve and blading the onions at the taco truck. "Okay," Alder said, bursting forward with a flourish and a flourish's cousin. "Shall we?" The silk drape towered over them, less fabric than expectation. The band quieted to a breath. A breeze gathered itself as if to help. "On 3, Alder said. They didn't need 3. They needed the smallest tug and the will to see what they had made. The sheet fell. Gasps scattered like birds. Even though Rowan had built every composition line, even though he knew the palette in his sleep, the mural still startled him the way sun on water sometimes does. It was bigger than their planning had allowed, and kinder. Hands, dozens, painted each other into a home. Not a house, not a floor plan, a home made of acts, mixing color, passing brushes, lifting someone to reach a higher spot. Plants curled around couchbacks. A bookshelf leaned like a friend. A cat silhouette, Sketch's unmistakable profile, sat on a low table observing with an expression of tolerated fondness. In one corner, tucked small enough to be a secret and big enough to be found, 2 figures stood on a rooftop under string lights. One had a copper streak glinting like a thread pulled through. The other's hair shimmered with a whisper of driftwood gray. Rowan's eyes stung, then overflowed into a laugh that cracked into a sound dangerously near crying. He lifted his hand to hide his face, then lowered it. Because what would be the point? He turned to find Louis not looking at the mural, but at him. "How did you—" Rowan managed. "I asked the paint," Louis said softly, because the mic was off now and the crowd had become its own weather system. "It told me where to hide the copper." "You're impossible," Rowan said, and laughed again and let himself be hugged by more people than he had thought he could stand in an evening. A boy darted forward to point at the rooftop. "That's you," he crowed, then flushed, embarrassed by his own certainty. Rowan crouched. "I think it's everyone who ever waited for the right light," he said, and the boy nodded solemnly as if entrusted with a secret. Music rose. The food trucks flirted with their fryers. The donations jar filled in coins and bills and little folded notes from kids who had only fractions of allowances but full hands. Sketch wove through legs, stopped to be admired, and approved of a temporary cardboard throne someone had made from the box the mic stand had arrived in. The night softened into midsummer. Faces blurred into a bright, kind crowd. Lewis was beside Rowan when it mattered, and elsewhere when other people needed the space. A choreography years in the making, executed with a professional's invisibility and a lover's attention. Rowan met the neighbors whose balcony herbs had scented his evenings, the teenagers who would loop through tomorrow to ask to paint, the old man who admitted he came here every other day to see what the children will do next. The foster staff told him stories they'd never had time to tell when time had been scarce and rooms small. Alder made a toast that spiraled, then landed like a gymnast and earned exactly the applause he'd hoped for. When the band packed up and the last paper cup found a trash bag, the courtyard didn't empty so much as exhale. The string lights dimmed to a lower hum. A last cluster of guests waved from the gate, one calling, "You did good, boys," in the tone that yokes pride to mischief. Up on the roof, the air smelt like terracotta and city breeze. They threaded past pots of rosemary and tomatoes, a bucket of clothespins, a love seat somebody had rescued from a theater and declared reborn. The lights here were smaller, the kind that were meant for intimate conspiracies. Lewis stopped among the pots and turned. In the quiet after applause, his voice finally had room for the thing it had carried all week. "I can't promise to be perfect," he said, almost smiling at how human that sounded. "But I will never disappear again." Rowan didn't answer immediately. He let the sentence sit between them until it made itself a chair. The rooftop had a noise of its own. Distant cars, a child's last laugh on a far balcony, a siren that changed its mind early and died away. He stepped forward and slid their hands together, fingers interlacing with that double click of recognition and relief. "You make it hard to hold a grudge when you keep being decent," he said. He lifted their joined hands to his mouth and pressed a kiss to the curve of Lewis's pointer finger. "I hate it," he added, smiling. "I know," Lewis said, equally smiling. He bowed his head until their foreheads met, skin to skin, breath to breath. Their noses bumped, and Rowan laughed first, Lewis second, and then the laughter softened into the hush of a kiss that had all night to go nowhere in a hurry. They kissed like people who had learned to take breaks, to breathe, to leave a little space for names. Slow, sure, with the roofline like a witness, and the city pretending not to look. Rowan slid his palm under the edge of Lewis's shirt, not for heat, for proof. Lewis's fingers mopped the back of Rowan's neck, the bones of his shoulders, the place at the hinge of his jaw that always made his mouth break open a little. The string lights trembled in the breeze and made tiny constellations around them that no telescope would ever find. They found the small alcove tucked behind a trellis where night collected. Plants framed the space like a curtain. The leaves whispered about a breeze that wasn't there. Here, the lights were soft enough to lie if asked. They kissed again and let their mouths talk for them. Shirt buttons learned patience. A belt loosened like a held breath. Cloth fell in small, polite sounds. Kisses trailed down skin, tasting the day's salt and the citrus of a shower, and the fig and driftwood scent they joked about enough to make it less dangerous and more theirs. Lewis touched Rowan's chest with his whole hand like he was settling a portrait on a wall, and set his name into his pulse. Rowan answered with Lewis's name like a vote. A promise landed somewhere between their throats and their ribs, spoken low, warm, urgent as an oath, and gentle as an admission. The narrative could have stayed if it were that kind of story, and spelled out every step. It wasn't. It knew how to turn away with good manners. What stayed was the way their hands found each other and held. Knees touched. A breath shuddered out, and another came back steady. What stayed was the way two people finally chose the same center with no one watching but the leaves and the lights. Heat folded into tenderness. Laughter threaded through like a ribbon to be pulled later and smiled about at breakfast. When morning found them, it did so shamelessly. Sunlight arrived through the herb pots with a clatter of brightness and declared itself against the kitchen tiles. The city was already moving. Somewhere nearby, a radio argued with a kettle. Birds held a committee on the balcony railing. Sketch voiced a complaint from the foot of the bed that boiled down to, "Your public has been waiting for 15 whole minutes and breakfast has not arrived." Rowan pulled the sheet higher over his shoulder and smiled into the pillow as the memory of warm night and cooler air slotted into place without jarring. He would draw the string lights later, he thought. Try to get them to look like how the air had tasted.
He sat up, hair a staticky mess, and watched Louis rifling through his cabinets in one of Rowan's older shirts, the soft gray one with a faded paint handprint across the stomach. The copper streak shone like a pronouncement in the sun. "You can't cook here," Rowan announced. "This is an artist's kitchen. It only knows how to boil noodles and make tea." "Watch me," Louis said, already cracking eggs with the same calm he brought to meetings that had too many people in them. "Toast, toast," Rowan said, wholly converted to domesticity without exactly consenting to such a dramatic transformation. He poured coffee and leaned his hip against the counter, scribbling on a nearby sticky note, because his hands mutinied if they weren't drawing. A quick line for light, a curve for a shoulder, steam lines that made a heart by accident and then on purpose. Sketch hopped onto a chair and then to the table, peered at the sketch, and gave it the equivalent of an approving blink. "At least someone appreciates my work," Rowan told him. Louis slid a plate across the counter. "I appreciate your work," he nodded at the sticky note, "and your theft of my best angles." "You have one side," Rowan said solemnly. "The rest of you is chaos." Louis laughed low and easy. He leaned across the small gulf of morning and kissed the corner of Rowan's mouth. A thank you, a good morning, a continuation of last night that didn't need trumpet fanfare to count as symphony. Later, after the dishes had agreed to wash themselves with help, Rowan stuck the sticky note on the fridge beside a new postcard. Alder had had the mural printed in miniature, glossy and too bright, as if the printer had loved it. On the counter, 2 mugs cooled, one labeled fig in a hurried marker scroll, the other tea. Beside a glass bottle holding a few stems of driftwood pale flowers someone had left in their mailbox as though the world conspired with metaphors.
Rowan leaned a shoulder into the fridge, watching Louis tie his hair back to keep it out of the eggs, like the most absurdly beautiful thing he'd ever seen do something as ordinary as Sunday. The world kept happening in the windows. The shout of a bus, the clatter of a neighbor's bicycle, Sketch's outraged chirp at a pigeon. But the center had shifted. It was here. It was 2 mugs and a cat with unreasonable opinions, and a man who asked permission with his eyes, even when asking if he could borrow the cinnamon. "You still act like you own me," Rowan said, teasing, because the joke had earned its right to stay. Louis looked up, grinned soft and so certain it could light the string bulbs on the roof by itself. "No," he said, crossing the kitchen in 3 steps and bracketing Rowan with elbows and intention. "I just never stopped being yours." The kiss that followed tasted like coffee and the end of running. Rowan felt the line anchor, then loosen, then hold in a way that meant he could move without falling. When they broke apart, the room looked the same as it had at dawn. That was the point. Ordinary magic is still magic. It just wears comfortable shoes. On the fridge, the postcard glinted. In the picture, hands painted each other into a home. And in the corner, 2 small figures on a rooftop kept their watch under lights that had no interest in going out. The mugs cooled a little further, framing the vase where pale flowers held as much light as they could. Sketch sprawled in a sunstripe and pretended he had been essential to the outcome. Home, Rowan thought, and knew he didn't have to draw the word for it to stay. The wall 2 blocks away would say it for him every day to everyone. And the person turning the toast while making fun of his sketching habit would keep saying it in 100 small sentences. "I'll pick up more basil. I like your dimples better when you're angry. I will never disappear again." On mornings after, on evenings before, they would practice those sentences until the air around them learned the language. And when Rowan left the apartment the next day, shoulder brushing Louis's in the doorway, he didn't look back to make sure it was all still there. He could feel it. Light had found the corners. They belonged. Thank you for listening to Mangalove's storytelling. If you find the story meaningful and enjoyable, please remember to give Mangalove a like and subscribe so you won't miss the newest stories. Wishing you a wonderful day.